Maybe nobody ever told you this. You can spend years loving an avoidant person and still walk away feeling like you were somehow standing outside the relationship the entire time. Close enough to touch them. Close enough to hear them say they care. Close enough to believe that one day, something would finally soften. Something would finally click. Something would finally make them stay emotionally present. But somehow, the closer you try to get, the further away they seem to drift. And if you have ever loved someone like this, you probably know the confusion, because nothing about it feels simple. They are not cruel. Not usually. In fact, sometimes they are deeply thoughtful, intelligent, funny, attentive in moments. Sometimes they love in flashes that feel almost overwhelming. A vulnerable conversation at midnight. A moment of closeness that makes you think. There you are. Finally, a weekend where they feel fully present. A look in their eyes that makes you believe the walls are finally coming down. And then, without warning, distance, coldness, withdrawal. The text messages slow down. The emotional warmth fades. The energy changes. And suddenly you are sitting there trying to solve a puzzle that keeps changing shape. What happened? What did I do wrong? Did I ask for too much? Did I become too emotional? Too available? Too needy? And somewhere inside yourself, you quietly start adjusting. You speak softer, need less, ask for less, shrink more. You become easier to love, or at least, you try to, because you believe if you can just find the right balance. Not too close, not too distant, not too emotional, not too demanding. Maybe then they will finally stop leaving. But here is the truth most people never hear. The issue was never that you loved too deeply. The issue was that you were trying to build closeness with someone whose nervous system experiences closeness very differently. And until you understand that, the entire relationship feels personal. Because from the outside, avoidance looks confusing, contradictory, sometimes even manipulative. One moment they move toward you, the next moment they disappear. One moment they tell you they miss you, the next moment they feel overwhelmed by your needs. One moment they crave connection, the next moment they act like connection itself is pressure. And if you are someone who loves deeply, especially if you lean anxious, this dynamic can slowly unravel your sense of reality. Because love starts feeling unstable. You begin measuring your worth through someone else's emotional availability. You begin interpreting distance as proof that you failed. And eventually, you stop asking what is true. You start asking what version of yourself would finally make them stay. But here is the painful irony. The more important you become to an avoidant person, the more complicated things often get. Not because they stop caring. And this part matters. Because many avoidant people do care. Sometimes deeply. Sometimes painfully deeply. But caring and feeling safe are not always the same thing. Especially for someone whose nervous system learned very early that closeness comes with consequences. That needing people is dangerous. That dependency costs something. That vulnerability eventually turns into disappointment, loss, control, or pain. And once a nervous system learns that lesson, especially in childhood, it does something incredibly intelligent. It adapts. Psychologists call this an attachment strategy. But if we slow it down, what we are really talking about is survival. Because no child wakes up one morning and decides, I don't need people. No child naturally prefers emotional distance. That happens when connection stops feeling emotionally safe. Sometimes love felt unpredictable. Sometimes caregivers were emotionally unavailable. Sometimes closeness came with criticism, control, shame, or emotional inconsistency. And somewhere along the way, the nervous system made a quiet decision. Don't depend too much. Don't need too much. Don't feel too much. Stay self-sufficient. Stay in control. Because control feels safer than closeness. And that strategy? It works. At least for a while. Many avoidant people become incredibly competent adults. Independent, capable, high-functioning. They learn how to survive without needing much from anyone. They become the person who handles everything alone. The person who seems emotionally steady. The person who rarely asks for help. And from the outside, that independence can even look attractive, confident, grounded, secure, until intimacy begins asking something deeper of them. Because relationships eventually require something independence cannot provide: emotional reliance, mutual vulnerability, interdependence. And this is where things often start shifting. Because for someone with avoidant attachment, closeness does not only feel good, it also feels risky. The more important someone becomes, the more exposed they feel, the more emotionally invested they become, the more vulnerable they feel to disappointment. And vulnerability, for an avoidant nervous system, can feel dangerously close to losing control. So something subtle begins happening, not always consciously, not always intentionally, but predictably. Distance enters the room. Maybe they suddenly become busy. Maybe communication changes. Maybe they pull inward emotionally. Maybe they stop initiating. Maybe they begin focusing heavily on work, productivity, friends, space, freedom, alone time. And if you are the partner on the other side of this, you often experience it as abandonment. Because what makes this dynamic so painful is that it usually appears right after closeness, right after intimacy, right after things begin feeling real. And this is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They think, if they loved me, this wouldn't happen. But avoidance is rarely that simple, because love itself is often not the problem. Fear is. Not obvious fear, not dramatic fear, quiet fear, subtle fear, the kind that disguises itself as, I just need space. I feel overwhelmed. Things are moving too fast. I don't know what I want. I just need to focus on myself right now. And sometimes those things are genuinely true. But underneath them, something deeper is often happening. The nervous system is reacting to closeness itself. Because to an avoidant system, closeness can feel strangely threatening. Not consciously, biologically. And neuroscience helps explain why. When intimacy begins increasing emotional dependency, it can activate the brain's threat detection systems, especially when earlier experiences linked closeness with emotional discomfort. The brain begins scanning for danger, not because danger is necessarily there, but because the body remembers. And this is the part almost nobody talks about. Avoidants are not always running from you. Sometimes, they are running from what being close to you awakens inside them. Need, dependency, exposure, the possibility of loss, the possibility of disappointment, the terrifying reality that someone now matters. And mattering, to someone avoidant, can feel frightening. Because if you matter, you could hurt them, you could leave, you could disappoint them, you could eventually become something they emotionally depend on. And dependency, that often feels unbearable to someone who built their identity around self-sufficiency. So they retreat, not always because they want to lose you, but because distance temporarily restores regulation. Distance feels safe. Distance feels familiar. Distance restores control. And meanwhile, you are standing on the other side interpreting the whole thing through a completely different nervous system. You think, if someone loves you, they move closer, they reassure, they communicate, they stay. So now two nervous systems are speaking completely different emotional languages. One says, come closer, so we feel safe. The other says, give me space so I feel safe. And without understanding this dynamic, both people end up hurting. One feels abandoned, the other feels overwhelmed. One pursues, the other withdraws. And suddenly, love becomes a battlefield between closeness and protection. But here is where things become dangerous. Because if you stay in this dynamic long enough, without understanding what is happening, you may begin abandoning yourself in the process. Not all at once. Quietly, gradually, you stop asking for reassurance. You stop bringing things up. You become hyper-aware of moods, hyper-careful, hyper-patient. You tell yourself, they just need space. You excuse things you never used to excuse. You wait longer than feels healthy. You lower needs that were never unreasonable to begin with. And without realizing it, your world slowly starts revolving around emotional unpredictability. Because now, your nervous system is adapting too. And this is where the story begins to change. Not just for the avoidant, but for you. Because there comes a moment, usually much later than it should, when you stop asking, why are they like this? And start asking something far more important. What has loving them slowly taught me to tolerate? And that question changes everything. There is something deeply disorienting about loving an avoidant person, because the relationship often begins with hope, real hope, sometimes even intensity. They open up just enough to make you believe something meaningful is forming. They let you see pieces of themselves that feel private, tender, unexpected. And because those moments are real, this part matters. Because they are real, you begin building trust around them. You think, maybe they are just slow to open. Maybe they have just been hurt before. Maybe love simply takes time for them. And at first, that patience feels noble. You tell yourself good things are worth waiting for. You tell yourself consistency will create safety. That if you love gently enough, carefully enough, they will eventually stop being afraid. But somewhere along the way, you start noticing a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The closer things become, the stranger the distance feels. After vulnerability, withdrawal, after emotional intimacy, confusion, after connection, silence. And if you have lived through this, you know how painful that contradiction becomes. Because intimacy starts feeling unstable. You stop relaxing into closeness. You start bracing for its disappearance. You stop fully enjoying connection. Because part of you is already preparing for the moment it leaves. And this is where many people begin blaming themselves. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I became too emotional. Maybe I asked for too much reassurance. Maybe I ruined it. But often, something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. Because for many avoidant nervous systems, closeness activates conflict, not comfort, conflict. And to understand why, we have to talk about something most people never think about: the difference between wanting intimacy and feeling safe inside intimacy. These are not the same thing. This is where people misunderstand avoidant attachment. They assume avoidants do not want love, but many do, deeply, sometimes more than they know how to admit. They want closeness, connection, partnership, understanding. They want someone who sees them, someone who stays, someone who feels safe. But here is the contradiction. The moment intimacy starts becoming emotionally real, the nervous system often begins interpreting that closeness as danger. Because closeness means vulnerability. And vulnerability, for someone wired toward avoidance, can feel strangely unsafe. Not intellectually, physiologically. This matters because people often assume avoidants are consciously making choices like, I care about this person, but I'm going to emotionally disappear. But many times, Their withdrawal is far more automatic than intentional. The body moves before the mind understands. Psychologists sometimes call this deactivation. The nervous system's attempt to reduce emotional intensity when intimacy begins feeling overwhelming. But in ordinary language, it looks like this. Suddenly, they seem distant, colder, less expressive, less available. The relationship begins feeling harder to access. Maybe they stop texting the way they used to. Maybe affection changes. Maybe they begin focusing heavily on work, their routine, their independence, their hobbies, other priorities. And because this shift often arrives after closeness, it leaves you emotionally spinning, especially if you lean anxious. Because anxious attachment interprets distance very differently. An anxious nervous system often says, something is wrong. Fix it. Close the gap. Restore connection. So now something tragic begins unfolding. One nervous system is moving closer to feel safe. The other is moving away to feel safe. And both people think they are protecting the relationship. But unintentionally, they begin activating each other's deepest fears. The anxious partner fears abandonment. The avoidant partner fears engulfment. One fears being left. The other fears being emotionally trapped. And because neither nervous system understands the other, love slowly turns into misunderstanding. The anxious partner starts protesting. More texts, more reassurance seeking, more attempts to reconnect. Not because they are needy, but because uncertainty activates survival instincts. Humans are wired for attachment. We are wired to notice distance, to seek repair, to restore closeness, especially when connection feels threatened. But to the avoidant nervous system, those bids for closeness can accidentally feel like pressure, expectation, emotional demand, and the more overwhelmed they feel, the more distance they create. So now the cycle intensifies. You reach, they retreat. You explain, they shut down. You try harder, they disappear further. And somewhere inside yourself, something quietly starts breaking. Because eventually, you stop asking for what you need confidently. You begin apologizing for having needs at all. You start saying things like, it's okay. I understand. Take your time. No pressure. Even when internally, you feel starving. And maybe this is the part nobody prepares you for. How exhausting it becomes to constantly reinterpret distance as patience, to keep translating inconsistency into potential, to call emotional absence just how they are, to convince yourself that loving someone means endlessly understanding them, while slowly becoming impossible to understand yourself. Because somewhere in this process, you begin disappearing too, not dramatically, quietly. You become hypervigilant. You monitor tone, timing, energy shifts, silences. You start noticing tiny emotional changes like your nervous system is scanning for weather patterns. And the truth is, it kind of is, because unpredictability changes the brain. Research around attachment and nervous system activation shows that inconsistency can heighten emotional vigilance. When closeness becomes unpredictable, the brain starts anticipating loss. You begin living emotionally braced, always waiting for the next withdrawal, always wondering, are we okay? Did I do something wrong? Should I say less? Need less? Ask for less? And here is the painful irony. The more you adapt to preserve the relationship, the further you drift from yourself. Because now your emotional world revolves around regulation, not intimacy. You stop expressing naturally. You start strategizing. How do I say this without overwhelming them? How do I ask for reassurance without sounding needy? How do I express pain without pushing them away? How do I love them without losing them? And slowly, without even realizing it, you stop asking the most important question: can this relationship hold me too? Because love was never meant to feel like emotional survival. It was never meant to feel like constantly earning closeness. It was never meant to require abandoning your own nervous system just to protect someone else's. And this is where something subtle but important starts happening. You begin mistaking emotional hunger for love. Because intermittent closeness, those moments when they finally soften again, can feel intoxicating. The vulnerable conversation, the unexpected affection, the sudden warmth after distance. And when it arrives, it feels relieving, like finally breathing again, like finally getting them back. But relief and security are not the same thing. Read that again internally, because many people stay trapped here for years, not because the relationship feels consistently good, but because moments of closeness temporarily soothe the pain, and the nervous system begins chasing relief, not stability. This is where relationships can quietly become addictive, not because the love is deep, though sometimes it is, but because unpredictability intensifies emotional attachment. The brain starts associating inconsistency with reward. Maybe this time things will stay good. Maybe this time they are changing. Maybe this time we finally made it through. But eventually, something painful begins surfacing. You realize you have been spending more energy preserving connection than actually experiencing connection. And that realization hurts, because suddenly, you start seeing what this dynamic has cost you: your peace, your certainty, your confidence, sometimes even your identity. And maybe for the first time, you ask a question that feels terrifying to say out loud. What if loving them has slowly taught me to betray myself? Not because they intended harm, not because they are bad, but because somewhere in trying to understand them, you stopped understanding what this relationship was doing to you. And that question, if you are honest enough to sit with it, becomes the beginning of something life-changing. Because healing begins the moment you stop asking only, why are they pulling away? And begin asking, why have I been staying so close to something that keeps hurting me? Because the truth is, this story was never only about the avoidant. It was also about the part of you that kept hoping love would finally feel safe. If only you learned how to deserve it. And that part deserves compassion, not shame, because there is a reason you stayed, a reason you tried so hard, a reason inconsistency felt familiar enough to tolerate. And that is where the deeper story begins. Here is the question almost nobody wants to ask. Not at first, because it feels too painful, too exposing, too unfair. Why did I stay? Why did I keep trying so hard? For someone who kept pulling away? Why did I keep explaining, understanding, waiting, hoping, long after the relationship stopped feeling emotionally safe? Because eventually, if you stay inside an avoidant dynamic long enough, the focus quietly shifts. At first, all of your attention is on them. Why are they like this? Why do they disappear? Why can't they just communicate? Why does closeness scare them? But after enough time, if you are honest, another question starts whispering underneath all the others. Why am I still here? And this is where the conversation becomes deeper. Because the truth most people do not want to hear is this: we do not only choose relationships, relationships also reveal us. They expose old wounds, old patterns, old survival strategies we never realized we were carrying. And sometimes, what hurts us most feels strangely familiar. Not healthy, familiar. Because familiarity and safety are not always the same thing. This matters more than most people realize, especially if you lean anxious, especially if somewhere in your life, love felt inconsistent, conditional, emotionally unpredictable. Because when closeness was unstable early on, something subtle often gets installed inside the nervous system. You learn to work for love, to earn it, to prove yourself worthy of staying for. You become emotionally perceptive, hyper-aware, sensitive to moods. You learn how to anticipate emotional weather, how to adjust yourself to preserve connection. And if that sounds familiar, you are not broken. You adapted. There was intelligence in it. Because when connection feels uncertain, adaptation becomes survival. Maybe you learned that being easy kept peace. Maybe over-explaining protected closeness. Maybe caretaking helped you feel needed. Maybe earning approval became the closest thing to emotional safety. And then one day, without realizing it, you meet someone avoidant, someone emotionally hard to reach, someone whose inconsistency feels strangely magnetic. And suddenly, an old nervous system story quietly wakes up. This feels familiar, not consciously, biologically, emotionally. You do not necessarily feel calm with them. You feel activated, drawn in, preoccupied, hopeful. And because there are moments of real connection, real tenderness, you keep believing resolution is close. You tell yourself, we just need communication. We just need time. They just need healing. If I stay patient enough, safe enough, loving enough, eventually they will let me in. But here is the difficult truth. Sometimes what keeps us stuck is not love. It is hope. Hope that the inconsistency will stop. Hope that the distance will soften. Hope that one day we will finally feel chosen by someone who struggles to choose closeness consistently. And hope, without boundaries, can become dangerous because hope has a way of making pain feel temporary. You tell yourself, this is just a phase. Things are improving. They are trying. And maybe sometimes they are, because many avoidant people genuinely are trying. Again, this matters. This is not villainy. This is often protection. But intention and impact are not the same thing. Someone can care deeply and still hurt you repeatedly. Someone can love you and still not know how to emotionally stay. And this is where many people become trapped. Because now you are no longer grieving what the relationship is. You are grieving the version of it you keep hoping it could become. The potential. And potential can be intoxicating, especially when there are glimpses, little moments that feel like proof. A vulnerable conversation, a weekend where they feel emotionally present, a rare apology, a moment of closeness that makes you think, there you are. I knew you were in there. And for a while, that hope becomes enough to keep you invested, even when consistency never fully arrives, even when your nervous system feels chronically anxious, even when you are losing pieces of yourself trying to preserve connection. And maybe this is a good place to pause for a second, not to fix anything, not to judge yourself, just to notice something. How tired you may have become, how exhausting it is to constantly carry the emotional weight of uncertainty, to overanalyze silence, to overinterpret distance, to keep translating emotional absence into patience, to love someone while quietly grieving them at the same time. Because this part matters. The grief often starts long before the relationship ends. And nobody really talks about that. How lonely it feels to miss someone who is still technically there. How confusing it feels to sit beside someone emotionally while feeling miles away from them. How painful it becomes to question whether asking for consistency means asking for too much. And somewhere inside this exhaustion, something important begins happening. You start seeing the cost of waiting, the cost of hoping, the cost of self-abandonment. Because little by little, you stopped centering yourself. You started organizing your emotional world around someone else's availability. Your mood became dependent on their mood. Your peace became dependent on their reassurance. Your confidence became dependent on whether they seemed close or distant that day. And that is not love. That is emotional survival, quietly dressed up as devotion. But here is where something begins shifting. Because eventually, most people hit a wall. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly, quietly. The nervous system gets tired. Tired of unpredictability. Tired of chasing closeness. Tired of translating inconsistency into meaning. Tired of hoping effort alone can create emotional safety. And one day, without planning for it, you notice something strange. You are no longer only sad. You are tired. And tiredness changes things. Because sadness still fights. Sadness still hopes. Sadness still negotiates. But exhaustion? Exhaustion starts telling the truth. And the truth often sounds something like this. I cannot keep abandoning myself to stay connected to someone else. That sentence, if you ever reach it, changes everything. Because for the first time, the focus shifts away from fixing them, away from understanding them, away from waiting for the relationship to finally become what it promised, and towards something far more uncomfortable. Yourself. What am I afraid of losing? Why has inconsistency felt familiar? Why have I confused longing with love? Why have I been asking someone emotionally unavailable to prove my worth? These are painful questions, but they are liberating ones too. Because healing rarely begins when someone finally chooses you. Healing often begins when you stop outsourcing your worth to people who cannot consistently hold it. And here is the strange thing nobody expects. The moment you stop chasing, the moment you stop trying to earn emotional safety, something inside you begins returning. Your clarity, your energy, your self-respect. Not instantly, but gradually. Like waking up after a long emotional storm. And maybe, for the first time in a very long time, you stop asking, how do I make this work? And begin asking a radically different question. What would it look like to finally stop abandoning myself for love? Because once that question arrives, there is no going back. And that is where freedom quietly begins. There comes a moment in almost every painful relationship dynamic when clarity arrives so quietly, you almost miss it. Not with drama, not with some cinematic ending, not even with anger, just exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones. The kind that comes after explaining yourself too many times, after rereading messages, after trying to decode silence, after shrinking yourself into someone more convenient to love. And eventually, something inside you whispers a sentence you never thought you would say. I can't keep doing this. Not because you stopped caring. And this matters. Because people often think healing begins when love disappears. But usually, that's not what happens. You still care. You still miss them. Part of you still hopes. Part of you still remembers the version of them that felt warm, available, present, the moments that made you believe this could really become something. And that is what makes letting go so painful. Because you are not only grieving a person, you are grieving possibility, the future you imagined, the safety you hoped would eventually arrive. The relationship you kept trying to build with someone who may never have had the emotional tools to build it with you. And grief like that is complicated because some days you miss them, and other days you miss who you became while hoping. The hopeful version of yourself, the loyal version, the patient version, the version that believed love could heal anything if you just stayed long enough. But somewhere inside that grief, clarity begins growing. And clarity sounds different than heartbreak. Heartbreak asks, why wasn't I enough? Clarity asks, why did I keep settling for so little? Heartbreak asks, how do I get them back? Clarity asks, Why was I fighting so hard for someone who kept leaving emotionally? Heartbreak blames itself. Clarity starts seeing patterns. And once you begin seeing patterns, something changes. You stop romanticizing inconsistency. You stop mistaking emotional unavailability for mystery. You stop calling emotional distance depth. You stop interpreting breadcrumbs as intimacy. Because eventually, you begin understanding something painful, but freeing. Love is not supposed to feel like survival. Read that slowly, because somewhere along the way, many people confuse emotional struggle with emotional depth. They think, if I fight this hard, it must be real. If I miss them this much, it must mean something profound. If this hurts so badly, it must be love. But intensity and intimacy are not the same thing. An activated nervous system can feel incredibly convincing. The highs feel euphoric. The closeness feels intoxicating. The rare moments of emotional warmth feel almost sacred. But if peace disappears the moment connection disappears, that is not security. That is instability. And instability has a way of teaching people to become addicted to relief. The text finally comes. Relief. They finally open up. Relief. They finally seem emotionally available again. Relief. But relationships are not supposed to survive on relief. They are supposed to grow through consistency. And maybe this is the moment where something uncomfortable lands. Because if you have spent years loving avoidant people or emotionally unavailable people, there is a chance that consistency itself may feel unfamiliar, sometimes even boring. That sounds harsh, but stay with me. Because if unpredictability shaped your attachment system, stable love can initially feel strange. You might unconsciously chase chemistry over consistency, intensity over peace, longing over safety, not because something is wrong with you, but because your nervous system learned to associate uncertainty with love. And healing means slowly teaching yourself something different. That peace is not boring. Consistency is not lack of passion. Safety is not emotional flatness. Sometimes safety is simply unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things take time to trust. This is where healing becomes less about understanding the avoidant and more about understanding yourself. Because eventually, the most important question stops being, why did they pull away? And becomes, why did I stay in emotional scarcity for so long? Not to shame yourself, never that, but to understand yourself compassionately. Because usually, there was a wound underneath the waiting, a fear underneath the chasing, a younger part of you that believed, if I love hard enough, I'll finally be chosen. If I prove my worth, someone will stay. If I become easy enough to love, I won't be abandoned. And maybe nobody ever told you this, but love was never supposed to cost you yourself. You were never meant to become smaller to preserve connection. You were never meant to silence needs to keep peace. You were never meant to confuse emotional starvation with patience. Real love, healthy love, does not punish you for having needs. It does not make you earn emotional safety every week. It does not make consistency feel like too much to ask, because asking for communication is not asking for too much. Asking for reassurance is not weakness. Wanting emotional presence is not neediness. Wanting reciprocity is not unreasonable. These are human needs, and the right relationship does not make you apologize for being human. Now, this does not mean avoidant people are bad. Let's be careful there, because pain has a way of turning understanding into blame, and blame rarely heals anything. Many avoidant people are carrying wounds too, fear too, protective patterns they never consciously chose. Some are trying, some are healing, some genuinely want connection, and simply do not yet know how to tolerate closeness safely. And compassion matters, but compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. That sentence alone might change someone's life. Because understanding someone's wounds does not mean sacrificing yourself to survive them. You can love someone and still admit, this dynamic is hurting me. You can understand someone and still choose distance. You can care deeply and still decide that care is no longer enough. Because love matters, but emotional safety matters too. And if someone repeatedly cannot meet you there, you are allowed to stop negotiating with pain. You are allowed to stop translating emotional absence into hope. You are allowed to leave the relationship that keeps teaching you to abandon yourself. And here is what nobody tells you about finally walking away. At first, it feels terrifying. Your nervous system panics. You miss them. You question yourself. You wonder if you made a mistake. You remember the beautiful moments and forget the painful patterns. You romanticize. You revisit memories. You reread conversations. And for a little while, the loneliness can feel louder than the relief. But then something unexpected starts happening. Quietly, gradually, you begin returning to yourself. You sleep better. You think clearer. You laugh more. You stop checking your phone every 10 minutes. You stop scanning for emotional danger. You stop overanalyzing silence. You start remembering who you were before love became anxiety. And maybe for the first time in a long time, you realize something startling. You were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person. And that realization, it hurts, but it frees you too. Because now, you stop chasing emotionally unavailable love. You stop auditioning for emotional safety. You stop trying to convince someone to choose you. And instead, you begin choosing yourself. Again, and again, and again, until one day, what once felt irresistible starts feeling familiar in the wrong way. You stop romanticizing emotional distance. You stop mistaking confusion for chemistry. You stop chasing people who make love feel uncertain. Because now, you know something your younger self did not. Love should not constantly make you question your worth. And when the right relationship arrives, you will notice something strange. You will not feel addicted. You will feel safe. The communication will not feel confusing. The care will not feel inconsistent. The closeness will not feel temporary. You will not have to earn reassurance. You will not have to beg for reciprocity. You will not have to perform emotional gymnastics just to feel chosen. Because healthy love does not feel like survival. It feels like exhale. And maybe that is the truth you were always searching for. Not how to make someone stay, but how to stop abandoning yourself when they cannot. So before you leave, I want to ask you something. Have you ever loved someone who made you slowly lose pieces of yourself, trying to keep the connection alive? Someone you deeply cared for, but who could never fully meet you emotionally? If this resonated with you, right? I choose myself in the comments. Not for anyone else. For you. As a quiet promise. That from this moment forward, you stop chasing love that asks you to disappear. And if this gave language to something you've been carrying silently, stay with us here on the Inner Odyssey. Because healing begins the moment you finally understand. You were never too much. You were just trying to be loved by someone who could not meet you where you were.